And that's what climate change is about. It is literally, not figuratively, a clear and present danger.
We are in the beginning of a mass extinction.
The ability of CO2 to do the heavy work of creating a climate catastrophe is almost nil at this point.
The price of oil has been artificially elevated to the point of insanity.
That's not how you power a modern industrial system.
The ultimate goal of this renewable energy, plan is to reach the exact same point that we're at now.
You know who's tried that? Germany. 7 straight days of no wind for Germany. Their factories are shutting down.
They really do act like weather didn't happen prior to 1910.
Today is Friday.
Yes, it is. It's Friday again. Time for another episode of Climate Change Roundtable. We're up to number 51 now, and we're glad that you're joining us here live for CCR 51. With us today is our usual panel. We've got with us Dr. Sterling Burnett, live from Texas, and we have Linnea Lueken, who's live from the Outer Banks, or near the Outer Banks, somewhere over there near the ocean on the East Coast. Thank you both for being with us today, and we're going to get right into it. We're going to talk about wind power fails. Friday Funnies. Everybody's seen some of the silly things that the alarmists have gone to promote wind power. And most interestingly, unlike, you don't see coal plants exploding on a regular basis. Coal power plants don't blow up. But yet the green future of wind does blow up on a regular basis. So let's just talk about a couple of bullet points here from you guys. What are your favorite things about wind power in terms of the Friday funny aspect of it?
Oh, I don't know. There was a video a few years back where they had a rare bird sighting in the UK somewhere, and they were videotaping this bird that hadn't been seen in the region in, decades, and then it got taken out in front of their eyes by a wind turbine blade. And it's sad. It's morbid funny, but I couldn't help it. It got a good little chuckle out of me.
For me, look, we could broaden this. It could be green energy funnies because it's electric cars blowing up and scooters and battery plants catching fire and houses catching fire from charging cars or batteries. It's but we're hitting wind this week. For me, look, I've been doing this. I've been looking at wind for longer than I care to admit. But way back when I was at a different organization, I was working on this issue. And at the time, I found quotes from scientists at the at one of the Sierra Club chapters, or the Audubon chapters, I forget which, who called wind turbines the Cuisinarts of the air. And they, at the time, there was a magazine called Wind Power Monthly. So this was a decade ago, more than a decade ago. And on the cover of it, it literally, a Wind Power Monthly, it had this scientist holding up a golden eagle who'd been shredded by a wind turbine. That was the cover photo. It's like, well, that's a ringing endorsement. So, it's just one thing after another. It's compiling things, some things I hadn't even thought of that are bad, it turns out, from wind. Anthony, you brought up one of them this week. When there's a lot of memes going around showing battery powered cars being charged by portable diesel generators on the highways where they run out. That's a meme. It goes around everywhere. I've seen it a dozen times, but I'd never seen the stuff about leaking diesel generators having to power wind turbines before, but there it is.
It's there, and we'll get to that in a moment. First, I want to introduce one of our fun videos for today, just, to kind of set the tone for what we're going to be talking about. We have this fantastic video. You may have seen it before, but, wind turbines tend to blow up when they get too much speed going on them. So let's play it and look. And there it goes. Its governor blew up. It lost its ability to regulate itself. Oh, no! Explode. That's why you don't want a wind turbine next to your house.
Yeah, but mind you, when that happens, it doesn't have to be next to your house. It can be a highway running a couple of 100 yards away where that blade gets suddenly tossed into to the road. If your school bus is unlucky enough to be there, it's a disaster.
Yep. And, wind turbines are very complex beasts. They've got a lot of mechanical parts going on, and they're out in a vibrational environment. They're up on top of a pole where the wind is shaking it constantly. And it's very tough to keep things going. My brother-in-law used to be the president of Cincinnati Gear Company back in Cincinnati, Ohio. And one of his biggest clients was the Tehachapi Wind Farm project in Southern California. And they had to make gearboxes for these wind turbines. And he said that keeping those gearboxes running, keeping them from, munching themselves was a huge task. And in fact, the company eventually went bankrupt because they got involved in wind power. They couldn't keep the product going, and they were killed by warranty issues. Here's another video, which is pretty funny as well. And it's talking about the top 5 different wind power fails that have been going on. So actually what we want to do, Andy, is skip to 151 on that if we can.
Yeah, that was lightning strikes. I have a friend who trained on wind, and lightning struck it and split the blades.
Here we go. All right. Here's one where it lost its ability to govern itself. One of the blades fractured due to the high speed, and now it's just basically destroying the gearbox, the tower, everything falling over. And there it goes. The Cuisinarts of the sky.
Cuisinarts of the air.
They make julienne fires.
I was going to say there's a pretty large wind turbine. I try not to say farm because it's a euphemism, but power plant near Palm Springs.
Project.
Yeah, near Palm Springs. That's pretty close to one of the highways there. And I'm looking at those videos thinking, man, if those blades are flying off, hundreds of yards away from the main tower, that would really suck. Except the good thing is that huge power plant of wind near Palm Springs is almost never turning. So I guess there's not too much threat from that one.
Oh, here's your rare bird, Linnea. Watch.
Protected raptor right there.
Ouch. That's tragic, really.
Yeah,
if you or I, Sterling, were out hunting and we shot an eagle by accident, we'd be in the clink.
Well, if they caught us. I mean, it would be one of those shoot, shovel, and shut up situations.
I didn't hear that.
It's not one of those I'd be hanging on my wall. God,
yeah.
Look at that. Look at that.
I challenge any climate promoter to show us a video of a coal power plant exploding.
Well, to be fair, I've seen some pretty epic videos of the entire casing line coming out of an oil well as it's being drilled from losing control of the downhole pressure. That it looks like, you've got these thick steel and iron tubings that go into the ground. And when it comes out at high pressure, it looks like spaghetti noodles pouring out the top of the derrick. It's not good.
Yeah, no, they have situations in Germany where they have had incidents where these things have, the blades have been thrown across highways. There was no one on the highway at the time. I mean, no one was driving there, so no one was killed. But that's just good fortune. It's not like, well, it's good that we planned it only to fall apart when there was no one on the highway, so it's okay. No, if someone had been there, they're dead. So it's just one thing after the other. It's killing birds and bats. It's falling down, just falling down. You have one of the things I guess we're going to talk about. I don't know when, I forget when you had it scheduled to run, but we are making these wind turbines ever larger, right? We went from 1 megawatt wind turbines to 1.5 to 2.5, and they have to get larger. To the nacelles have to be bigger. The gearboxes have to be bigger. Gearboxes which have to be oiled, pretty regularly. I assume that's one of the reasons they catch fires, because the maintenance not kept up, and the mechanism that's supposed to shut them down when the winds are blowing too high aren't working properly. But the engineering is not very good, it turns out, as they've been making these ever larger turbines. They just haven't accounted for the fact the additional weight and torque from these larger turbines on the monopoles, the shaft that holds them up. And so often when they're not shredding, when they're not just blowing up, you have these things all of a sudden just falling over. And it doesn't happen, to be fair, that doesn't happen so much with the smaller ones, because they took a lot of time to engineer those, but they're trying to get ever bigger ones so much faster. I don't know. It's like, well, I'm not going to go there. I don't want to get us banned for saying something about vaccines. But it's like you rush a product to market before you've properly accounted for the additional stresses and things, the things that could go wrong. And then you're surprised when that happens. And of course, the wind turbine companies are paying for that. You talked about your friend who worked at the company that did the gearboxes, right?
Right.
Well,
that was my brother-in-law.
Yes. Siemens and GE both reported huge losses on their wind this year. Why? Higher warranty costs, having to go back in and constantly fix things. And it's not just onshore wind. So you got these huge offshore winds, some of them floating. Well, floating offshore wind are tethered to the ground still with wires. The wires are snapping. Do you really want a wind turbine flopping around out there in the ocean? So they're just having to spend ever more and more higher costs, and they're losing billions, not hundreds of thousands, not millions, billions of dollars on their wind energy.
Right. And that's exactly why the Cincinnati Gear Company, which my brother-in-law was president of, went out of business. They produced all these gearboxes for the Tehachapi wind farm. They could not keep them running. The warranty service killed them. And it's because it's a very difficult environment to work in. You've got extremes of temperature. In California, down there, they would go from over 100 degrees Fahrenheit to down below freezing. And then they've got the vibration and the inability to service easily, all kinds of problems. And so it just basically made for a huge loss for them. And the company went out of business literally because of the gearboxes for wind turbines. All right, so I want to go to another thing that happened this week. Sterling mentioned this earlier about wind turbines in Scotland. Yes, they are hooking up diesel generators to power wind turbines. Why? Well, it goes back to the maintenance issue. Because the bearings on these huge wind turbines are so stressed, they have so much load from these blades, not just load, but torque in different directions. If the wind dies and these things just sit there, the bearings basically smash up. They just crunch themselves. And so they have to keep the turbine blades going. Now, normally what happens is, because they're hooked up to the grid and they're supplying energy to the grid, they draw some power back from the grid, and then that power keeps the blades turning in slow motion to keep those bearings lubricated and to keep them from crunching themselves. Well, in this case, they had some kind of problem with getting back energy back from the grid. And so what do? They went out and installed a diesel generator for every wind turbine to keep it running when the wind wasn't going. And it's madness. It's absolute madness, defeating the purpose of green energy to have such a thing. And yet, go ahead, Sterling.
Well, this was not, you said they had to do this. You make it sound like it was a one-off thing. When I read some of these stories, it's not a one-off thing. This is a regular feature. Some of these turbines were being run on diesel generators for 8 hours at a time. These generators had to be fueled and running to turn 60 of the 71 turbines, I think, at this one wind facility. So that's a lot of diesel fuel to be burning. And it turns out the diesel generators weren't very well maintained, the lines and things. And so they leaked thousands of gallons of fuel oil into the environment to run the wind turbines. And it wasn't a one-off. This happens fairly regularly, and they're not telling you this when they sell the virtues of wind as a pollution-free energy source, as an emissions-free energy source. I can't think. It's like, say what you will about a coal-fired power plant or a natural gas plant, they are less polluting than any diesel generator I know of.
Right. Right. And, interesting thing about coal plants is they typically build those with anywhere from 2 to 4 banks of generators and boilers. And so when one generator goes down needing maintenance, they run the other 2 or 3. And so there's never an interruption from a coal plant. Never. And they don't need a diesel generator parked outside to keep the thing running. They just basically engineered it from the get-go to have its own maintenance schedule. With these wind turbines, they can't predict the maintenance schedule sometimes because of the vagaries of the wind and the weather. I mean, some days, these things are getting huge amounts of vibration up there. Other days, they're not getting any. So creating a maintenance schedule for that to say, well, we have to service it every 30 days or every 90 days or whatever it might be is difficult because the weather can change dramatically. And in fact, the weather might change so dramatically in such a period that it shakes the turbine to death, before its maintenance is ready. And boom, that's why you see these things falling down, catching fire and vibrating on blades and throwing them off and all this sort of thing. It's madness from an engineering standpoint.
Yeah, technically you could create an artificial maintenance schedule simply by saying, on this day, on this hour, every month, we're going to shut down this bank of turbines. And I mean, they could force them to shut down like they automatically are supposed to do when the wind blows too fast, right?
Right.
But that would require taking them offline for a good chunk of time. So they're not. So you better have that backup energy ready during that time all the time. And there's no way of guaranteeing that they will.
Right. Sterling, a couple of years ago, there was a big wind power failure in Texas, if I recall correctly. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened there?
Well, it was not just a wind power failure. It was a power failure in the middle of winter, not Texas's peak energy time, by the way. We had a big cold spell in November 2 years ago. So,
not a global warming spell?
Not a global warming spell. It was colder than average, much, much colder than average. And so it was a comedy of errors. The wind turbines, we have, it turns out, 35 gigawatts of wind, nameplate capacity wind in Texas. And 2 days before the freeze came, they were producing more than 28% of the power. And then the winds died and the freeze set in. And the blades froze over. So we went from 28% to 1% in about 6 hours. And that was okay. We had wind, we had natural gas and coal, even though we'd shut down quite a few coal-fired power plants because the wind had put them out of business when it was working. But then when the electricity demand really rose, the operator said, oh, we've got to divert all the power to people's homes. So they cut off the transition stations for natural gas pumping facilities, where the natural gas flows through. So they cut power off to them. Well, guess what happened? Natural gas didn't flow in the freeze. And so they weren't getting to the power plants that were supposed to be powering people's homes. So then they shut down. And then we had the real crisis. 100 people died. We recently had another freeze in Texas just this last week, and wind once again dropped from 35 gigawatts to 1.6 gigawatts in a day. But we had sufficient wind and solar. I mean, we had sufficient natural gas and coal, and ERCOT didn't turn off the electricity to them. So we didn't have the crisis. Where they did have a crisis, Austin, the Berkeley of Texas, they had a crisis because they are 100% wind. And then,
that
of course,
blows.
Yeah. Well, the problem was it didn't, right? And now another problem that we all faced is that a lot of places had down power lines. That's natural during a freeze. Tree limbs fall, power lines themselves just get heavy with the weight of ice, and we had a lot of ice, and some of them broke. So we had about 400,000 people without power for periods of time, but every place except Austin came back online within hours. Austin was offline for a long time because they're 100% wind. Great stuff.
Well, good for them.
Good for them. Yep.
Hey,
You reap what
Linnea,
you sow is what I say to that.
do you have any experience with wind power over there on the East Coast? Aren't there some offshore wind farms near you?
Well, they sure are putting in some Dominion Energy likes their offshore wind. There's pretty significant investments, a bit further north than where I am. I think they're more up in North Carolina and off of like Rhode Island and stuff like that. It's supposedly not going very well for them either. Some people have noticed that their electricity costs have gone up quite a bit. And and that's partially to do with that, partially to do with natural gas is pretty expensive in the Northeast in general because there's not the needed pipeline infrastructure, but that's a whole other video.
Yep.
But but it's starting to kind of upset some environmentalists too. And I think that Sterling probably can quote chapter and verse on the situation up there better than I can. But it started in the UK. They started noticing that whales were being driven into shipping lanes a lot more frequently, and were getting hit by boats, and were getting stuck in too shallow of water come the time when the tide went out. And we're ending up dead on the beaches and stuff. And that's starting to be seen on beaches in the East Coast as well. The more of these turbine operations that they start putting up. And, the correlation isn't, it's not we don't know for sure, but it does kind of seem like that might be a factor.
I'll get right to you in a moment, Sterling, but I want to say one thing. This whales communicate with extremely low frequency sounds, and they do it over long distances. And so these wind turbines, because they have this slow rotation, produce a very low frequency vibration. And from my perspective, and I'm not a biologist, but I never played one on TV. We have this low frequency being introduced into the water, and I would suspect that probably confuses the whales. That would be my guess. Sterling?
It doesn't just confuse them; it harms them. Sound is how they navigate. Sound is how they locate their prey. Sound is how they avoid, monopoles in the sea and lines. So it's true. We recently had a spate of whale beachings, most of them off the coast of New Jersey, where they're some of the farthest along. But the turbines, for the most part, aren't up yet. What they're doing right now is really harmful to whales. It's the sonar blasting to try and find where to anchor the different turbines. So they have to go and they had to do subsurface sonar and blasting into the ocean, air blasting into the ocean, to see where it's safe to install these. And that causes a lot of noise. They've only done necropsies, as far as I can tell, on one whale, and they say, oh, well, sound didn't kill it. Well, okay. For that one whale, sound didn't kill it. And maybe for none of them, truthfully, sound killed them. But did it force them into shipping lanes? Because ship strikes are the biggest killer of whales. Some of these whales, the North Atlantic right whale, for instance, are supposedly protected by the Endangered Species Act and the Marine Mammals Protection Act. It's not doing a very good job in stopping these wind farms from being put in their critical habitat. Some places where they loaf year round and through their migration corridors in coastal Virginia. So we're putting whales at risk because it's shipping that we know kills them, number one, fishing lines that we know is the second largest problem for them. And of course, we're moving fishers out of their traditional fishing areas into other areas where the whales are also being forced into from the sound and the turbines. It's not a comedy of errors. It's a tragedy of mounting errors that is threatening whales. And so people say, oh, well, it's just coincidence that all these whales have come up now. There's no proof. Environmentalists are saying this. Whale groups are more concerned. Groups that are specifically concerned about whales are very concerned. People at U.S. Fish and Wildlife has gone on record as being very concerned. But a lot of environmental groups are defending this because they're so concerned about climate change that every other environmental concern takes a back seat. So they immediately leap to the defense and say there's no proof that these wind farms, offshore wind, is killing whales. But here's the correlation. We have a period where many more whales are beaching, and we don't know how many aren't floating up on shore, how many are just dying and, eventually sinking to the bottom without ever being known about. And it corresponds to the same time that we're doing all this blasting in whale habitat.
I'm not laughing at you, Sterling. I'm just laughing at the caption here. If they were left whales, the administration would care more. Oh my, that's great.
So it happens at the same time there's blasting, and shipping traffic is reduced because we all know about the supply chain issues. The only part of shipping that has increased in the past couple of years is the shipping, the back and forth of these ships that are either servicing wind turbines that are going up in some places or that are testing to find places to sink wind turbines. That's where shipping has increased. But we're sure that, the environmentalists, you hear them, they sound like Al Gore. Oh, no, there's no evidence that that offshore wind is killing whales. It's like, well, okay.
Right.
Well, they'll split hairs. Sure. They'll split hairs into infinity over it. You could probably have a wind turbine fall over into the ocean, smack a whale on the head and kill it. And they'll say, well, it wasn't really the turbine. It was the wind pushing over the turbine. And that can't be helped.
In fact, we've got a story about that very thing. Well, maybe not smacking whales on the head, but we've got a story about wind turbines falling over. It's becoming a big problem. Here you go. Report investigates giant wind turbines falling over and other industry issues. Yep, they do fall over. We saw some video of them before, and it's just simply because they vibrate themselves to death, and they're up on a giant monopole, and, there's lots of stresses and torques involved, and they just simply fall down.
Well, and it's the bigger ones that are falling. We have laws in effect in a lot of places that set setbacks for the 1.5, 2.5 megawatt wind turbines. They're not adjusted for the 6 megawatt wind turbines. So when a 6 megawatt that hasn't been tested properly goes up, the monopole is not structurally sound to stand up to all the torque. This is even if the blades aren't destroyed. It's just they've been rushed into production and they haven't been tested for the stresses, and they're bigger. And the setbacks may or may not be far enough from highways and houses such that if they fall, people aren't in the way. Of course, when they explode, who knows what kind of setback you have to have for an exploding wind turbine, like a monster javelin flying at hundreds of miles an hour in your direction.
And they won't let us have lawn darts.
Yeah, they won't let us. Lawn darts. The good old days when you held fireworks as they exploded. Yeah.
All right, so let's go on to the next problem of wind turbines up on those monopoles. They catch fire, and guess what? Just like they're saying with the whales. Oh no, that's just a coincidence. It happens rarely. They're saying now wind farms fires are far more common than reported. Well, that makes a lot of sense because a lot of these things are out in the middle of nowhere, run by private companies. And if, there's not a news investigation team around or somebody with a cell phone to capture it, these things go unreported. And guess what? There seems to be a lot of them going on. And what are you going to do?
What's that black stuff coming from it? It looks like an air emission to me. I'm told that these things have no emissions. That looks like a pretty severe emission to me.
Well, I think it's an omission emission.
It's an omission of emission. Yeah, it's like, look, we need to test these things for soot.
Yeah.
Because soot's a regulated pollutant, and I have a feeling that's a lot of soot going up into the air. It's one thing after the other. They catch fire, maybe, and of course on the ground, if they're battery backup, the batteries might catch fire. So we just had another incident just this week of a fire in an airplane from I believe it was like one of those personal devices. I don't think it was a Kindle. I don't know. I don't want to name anybody, but whatever those devices that, I forget what the general term for them are. It was either one of those or a cell phone caught fire in the luggage, and it wasn't because people were rubbing two sticks over it trying to start a fire. It's because the battery itself just spontaneously combusted. It's crazy.
It is. And, the fact that they're out there suppressing or maybe not reporting these fires is just what, the whole green energy movement's all about. They don't want to report on any of the negatives associated with this stuff. They just simply want to say, we're saving the planet, and therefore it's much more important. You got to use this because it's green and it's what we tell you to use. It's just madness. There's no thought going into the long-term planning of this stuff. Like they're just rushing to grab the money that's available from grants and other things to get these wind turbines out there and deployed. So another problem that happens is that the Siemens Energies, they've got a whole bunch of problems. High failure rate in some components. Aggregate net losses rise to $4 billion on wind energy. Well, that's not how you can run. That's not good capitalism. It doesn't work. And eventually, these companies are going to say, you know what? Wind doesn't work. We're going to get out of it.
As long as government pays them, they'll stay in it if they can get enough subsidies, right? From a capitalism point of view, if it were pure capitalism, we wouldn't have this issue because wind turbines wouldn't be being built all across the country. They are built specifically because government intervened in the market and said, you must use these power sources, even if they're not economic, and to lower the cost, we'll subsidize them. They mandate it and subsidize it, and that's the only reason these companies got into the business. And now their warranties, Siemens lost $4 billion, GE 2.2 billion, and we haven't even gotten to the third or fourth or fifth, I forget where we're at, problems with wind, which is going to be I think a growing issue, and that's the pollution problem. I don't know if that was next in line or if we have that.
Yes, it is. In fact, we've got a story up here about the Scottish wind farms, the same ones that have the diesel turbines hooked up to them. They're worried that they don't monitor toxic leading edge erosion, meaning that the blades, which are made out of composites, plastic, things like that, are flaking off and spraying, toxic material all over the landscape behind them. Gosh, that's terrible. I mean,
we hear a lot about microplastics and plastics. They had some pretty good pictures in some of these stories of the edge of these blades. They come off the line very pristine, really smooth looking. The wind is simply shredding them. It's shredding them at the edge. They're talking. I think they said that every turbine could dump 64 kilograms or of plastic pollution and resin and the chemicals that go into it. They're worried about all the chemicals that are leaching into the soil. They're worried about all the waste, and it's not being picked up. And a member of parliament from up there said, "Hey, what's the government's response to this?" And they said, "We have no responsibility for it. We're doing nothing about it. We've known about it for some time, but we don't have laws on the books to force the companies to do it. We're not doing anything about it. We say the companies should be responsible." And that's where they left it. It's like, hold it. You have no laws making them responsible, and they're not evidently responding. Instead, what's happening is chemicals are leaching into the soil that the Scottish people are not very happy about. Plastics are flying everywhere. And of course, when these microparticles fall to the ground or are thrown to the ground, they don't just sort of stay where they are. Some people have noted that Scotland gets some rain sometimes, And when the rain comes, it washes things into their pristine rivers where they have salmon fisheries that are noted around the world. And so these microplastics and resins are getting into the streams.
Yep.
So one more strike against wind. Another problem that, frankly, even I was not, when I was thinking, for the decade or more that I've been working on wind issues off and on, I never considered the shredding of turbines, the edge of just little pieces of composite plastics and particles shredding off and falling to the soil and going wherever it goes.
Well, obviously they didn't either.
Yeah, no, they didn't either.
Yeah. It's amazing, all of the different flaws that are showing up. It's what we've got here. You called it a comedy of errors. Well, I think it's a comedy of a law of unintended consequences. They just simply rushed into this without any long-term testing and just simply didn't pay attention to all the other possible things that might happen by putting these things together. All right, we got one final story to show you. This one here is about loss again. With all these things adding up, where we've got the wind power, not producing and everything else. Let's take a look at this one, Andy. We've got this next article, number 10, which is, I accept, there we go. GE Renewable Energy confirms $2.2 billion of loss in 2022 because their wind turbines don't work and they're high maintenance and they fail. So that's two companies now, Siemens and GE, both showing huge losses. What's the future of wind power going to be if these companies decide to pull out? Well, there really isn't any future. And then what about the environmental concerns of cleaning up these things when these companies abandon these things? I mean,
No.
I stood on the south point of the big island of Hawaii a few years ago in the middle of the wind farm that they'd put up there around, over 20 years ago. And they had wind turbines, that had shredded their blades, dropped their blades, just simply dead on the landscape, doing nothing. And the Hawaii News was talking about, well, how are we going to clean this up? Because the company went bankrupt and who's responsible and so forth and so on. The day that a wind turbine farm that has basically died on its own becomes a EPA Superfund site might be the day people start paying attention to what they've really done to the environment with these things.
Well, Hawaii is fairly unique in that regard, I think, in the sense that they just leave them standing and rotting. In most places, when they decommission them, or when they decommission themselves by falling to the ground, they have to dispose of them. And it's a multi-step process. And there are only a few, look, they don't recycle it. Technically, right now, it's either impossible or exorbitantly expensive to recycle it because of all the composite materials, the way they're crammed together, the chemical bonding. You can't do it. And so they have to go to solid waste facilities, municipal dumps. Only a few qualified to host them. And the ones that are increasingly saying, we don't want them. It's because they take a lot of waste. And every wind turbine takes up a single wind turbine takes up a lot of space. And you want to talk about the pollution, the waste, a solid waste problem. A turbine comes down or is taken down. It has to be chopped up to be transported and stored. It has to be crushed. These aren't done using electric vehicles, by the way. Big Caterpillar tractors, big bulldozers running back and forth over them again and again. There's no crusher. There's no car crusher for a wind turbine.
No.
And then they have to be loaded onto diesel powered trucks because aren't a lot of battery powered trucks and taken long distances to waste dumps, or new waste facilities have to be opened, which are typically going to be in where land is cheap, which means typically it's going to affect the poor and those on fixed incomes and minorities because that they live in places where land are cheap. And, they're just dumped in a big hole. And so you've got there are some pictures of what it looks like when you decommission these things, and it takes up a lot of space.
It does.
That's not even talking about the space of the wind farms. So it's like,
Yeah. I don't think there's ever been a case of a coal plant taken somewhere and buried after it's been chopped up. They recycle those things. They recycle all the steel. They recycle, everything with those things when they decommission them. Wind turbine, not so much. I will say that this week, someone supposedly said they'd made a breakthrough in the ability to recycle wind turbine blades, some kind of breakdown. But I got to imagine that involves toxic chemicals, and that you've got to turn it back into the component plastics or composites or whatever. So there's toxic chemicals involved in that. So it may not be totally green, but there's so many problems. And I want to point out that our own Linnea Lueken has produced a video talking about all these issues on wind problems and their failures and their lack of profit and all this stuff. Linnea, why don't you tell us about it, and we'll take a look at one of the clips from it.
Sure. Some of you guys have kind of kept up with my little energy series that I've been posting periodically to the Heartland YouTube website. And so I've got one on wind coming out. So you guys, we're going to play like a clip from it as a sneak peek for when it goes up, hopefully very soon, because it's basically done. So it'll be up there and you'll get to see the whole thing. But I wanted to play like a little clip from a section where I discuss some of the lesser known elements of wind power that can make it a little bit more problematic environmentally. Just nothing to be found. The benefits of wind power for the environment itself are also kind of open to question too. Sure, if all you're worried about is carbon dioxide, they emit none at the point of generation, so, there's that. However, they still do need a backup power source that more often than not is going to be a net emitter. And don't forget, these things are made with a lot of cement, which accounts for about 8% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions. But that's not really my focus here. The most obvious environmental impacts from industrial wind development is going to be its impacts on land, people, and animals. Wind-powered electricity displaces far more land than solar, nuclear, or fossil fuels when you look at each source and break down their construction, the mining involved, and the eventual installation. One study by Strata Policy found that a 1,000 megawatt wind power plant would require 133 square miles of land, while something like nuclear would only use 1.3 square miles. Wind is by far and away the most land-hungry energy source. This is especially true when you consider the fact that the turbine blades actually can't be recycled and end up in special landfills, which there are only a handful of them that can take the materials. It's also not the case that all land is great for wind energy. Most ideal locations are going to be filled first. As the best positions for wind generation are filled, for new wind facilities to produce the same amount of energy, even more land and more turbines are needed. There's a catch there too, and that's something called the braking effect that is observed in very large turbine fields. So the power output of wind facilities that are downwind neighboring wind power plants can be reduced by 20% or more. So that's an additional 20% on top of the already low capacity factor. Large wind facilities also can disrupt radar stations and make flying aircraft nearby hazardous. Birds are special victims of wind turbine blades. Fans of wind energy like to claim that it's not a big deal, while you will go to jail and pay hefty fines just for possession of one bald eagle feather. Wind power facilities are given special permission in the form of a take limit to kill bald and golden eagles. There may also, and this isn't talked about a whole lot, but may be some health effects on humans as well when large fields of turbines are sited too close to where people live. The constant infrasound and low-frequency noise, as well as nighttime blinking lights and daytime turbine flicker, have been claimed to cause health issues like sleeplessness, headaches, and even some heart problems. The noise issue might also be a problem offshore, and there is some indication that this kind of noise might affect migrating whales nearby and cause them to beach themselves. While it is true that wind turbines don't directly emit carbon dioxide while generating power, there are obviously a lot of questions to consider before accepting them as a larger source of energy. Okay, we can stop it here. The major issue is the...
Well, that was great, Linnea. I look forward to seeing that entire video posted online. Yeah, you hit all of the salient points. So, bottom line here is, I guess we can say wind power blows. I mean, what else can you say about it?
Yeah. You know, I have looked at it for a long time. The only thing I can find to recommend it is if you happen to be a recipient of the huge subsidies. I can understand why you would be out there cheering for it, but for the average resident, for ratepayers, for energy users, for taxpayers, and for the environment, it has nothing to recommend it. It takes up space when it's running. It takes a lot of mining to produce them. Offshore wind is the largest per kilowatt hour producer of energy, largest single user of rare earths, critical metals, and minerals of any power source. You have to move just enormous, thousands of tons of overburden material to get the materials for the magnets and then the backup batteries for offshore wind turbines. And you know what the second largest user per kilowatt hour is? Onshore wind turbines. So, and of course they're produced, if you care about children not being forced into dirty, unsafe mines in Congo, or slave laborers in China being used to produce and live in the toxic slag dumps that are left behind from this mining, then that doesn't recommend it. And by the way, even the Biden administration admits these are problems. Anthony says, well, what's going to happen when Siemens and GE get out of the business? Either they go under or they just abandon the business. Well, the natural response would be, oh, well, we'll get our stuff from China, right? Except that Joe Biden's big infrastructure plan says that we're going to move to green energy. We're going to do this. We're going to have all these charging stations and all these wind turbines from sea to shining sea. Sea to flickering sea now. But we're going to do it with U.S. manufactured, U.S. mined materials, except he's blocking mines. We're not mining those materials here. We're certainly not refining those materials here. And we're not largely manufacturing, though we're manufacturing some of it, but we get the materials that we use to manufacture it from slave labor and child labor. And so it's like, he set up a system that is doomed to fail. If he follows the one law, only use domestic, or a certain percentage has to be domestically manufactured and mined and refined, that's impossible. The car companies say that we're not going to be able to hit this goal with your domestic manufactured policy, because we're not doing the raw materials here. And he just banned another mine recently.
The whole thing is just virtual signaling, We're greening the planet. We're saving the planet. Wind power is doing all these wonderful things by not making emissions. But the people that are pushing this, most of them have never held a real job in their life. They've never actually had to produce anything. They've never actually had to deal with consequences of their own action, where they designed something and it blew up and it hurt somebody, or it failed and the warranty had to be put back onto the manufacturer and they had to recall. A lot of these folks are not engineers. They don't understand grid systems. They don't understand manufacturing. They don't understand any of this stuff. And yet they are professing that they know the way forward for our energy infrastructure for not just the United States, but the world. All right, we're going to go to questions now. We've had a lot of folks that have popped up questions during our discussion. We're going to bring up some of those now and talk about those, and I'll field those with the panel. So Alan Griffith asked, when the current generation of turbines have either all blown up or exceeded their useful lives, what will they be replaced with? That's a darn good question. Guys, what are your thoughts?
Well, my suspicion is, whatever technology is getting the biggest boost from government at the time, that's what they'll be replaced with. It might be more wind turbines, might be newer and better wind turbines. It might be solar panels, or people might have come to their senses, and it might be the next generation of nuclear, next gen nuclear, modular nuclear reactors that they just approved a new design for. or we might be, back on gas, coal, and oil.
Yeah. Might be polar bears and hamster
you're talking.
wheels.
Yeah, there was a Dilbert cartoon. There was a Dilbert cartoon a few years ago that I loved, where Dogbert was saying he runs the green energy company in San Francisco. Buy us. It's all used. All we use is recyclable materials, or renewable materials. And then you go down to the power plant, the boiler, and they're throwing a hippie wrapped up in a carpet into the boiler.
We're going to get banned on YouTube for saying that.
Look, we already have Soylent Green as people with the composting of people and using it in gardens. Who knows what we'll be using for an energy source? I do know that we're creating a huge toxic waste problem that we haven't even really begun to consider and answer.
Same thing with solar panels.
Well, at least solar panels have somewhat of a marginal benefit depending on where they are, depending on placement. Wind is just, people talk a lot about having a diversified grid so that if something fails for one reason or another, you're able to quickly take it up or quickly replace it with something else. But the problem is, usually when you diversify something like a stock profile, you don't put poor performing elements into it on purpose, knowing that they're poor performing just because, we want to have more stuff in here. That's not so good. But in terms of the wind turbine replacement, they're already replacing, they'll take out like 10 of the smaller turbines and replace them with one bigger one as they start kind of crumbling and falling over on themselves. They're just not producing at the level that they expected them to. Man, I would not hold my breath that this wind turbine thing is going to lose popularity anytime too soon, just because it is a big moneymaker for them. And, with the exception of the losses that they're having due to their warranty issues, as long as the government steps in and says, hey, we'll cover you, just keep putting these things in, as long as it's still the law to increase your share of renewables every year on the energy grid, then it's going to keep going. They don't care.
But one thing, because you said something that was very key there, as long as the government, we know, right? We can have a new Congress. We can have a new president, and they can say, we're not going to renew the renewable energy tax credit. We're not going to renew the production tax credit. And we have a history. We have examples of what happens to the industry when this happens.
Yep.
It has been redone. It was supposed to expire a long time ago, and it has been redone or re-upped, I should say, through the omnibus process that they do at the end of every year, it seems like now, where they just cram everything into one big bill. And one of the things they typically cram in there is the production tax credit. But in the few times that it has elapsed, according to the law, within days of the production tax credit lapsing, factories shut down. People are laid off because they can't last a week without subsidies. And if we just take those subsidies away, it goes away. So if we get an administration with a backbone and common sense, and we get a Congress of the same, the industry shuts down as soon as the tax credits go away.
Yep, and that's going to be a major collapse. Okay, next question that we've got. We had one from a fellow by the name of Reed, I believe it was. There we go. What's the average life of a wind turbine, and does the output deteriorate over time? Well, that's a question I can't answer, but that sounds something like something Linnea would know.
Yeah. So any moving mechanical part is going to suffer from these kinds of issues. And that's part of the problem that GE is finding. You have certain part warranties on moving parts. And Anthony, you talked about this with your brother-in-law's company. I have a chart somewhere that shows wind output deterioration over time. It's not as extreme as something like photovoltaics, which have a very measurable decline over time that, you can almost set a watch by it. But They do. I think the average life that the companies state is something in the range of 25 to 30 years. But realistically, it depends on the environment that they're put in. Some places are seeing really, really short-lived wind turbines, just less than 10 years kind of a failure rate. And others are seeing, well, we haven't really found any that are making that 30-year mark, I don't think. But I could be wrong on that, but I don't think that we've seen one that reaches the manufacturer's claim yet.
Yeah, and because they couldn't do any real long-term testing on these things ahead of time to find out what their real lifetime would be. Okay, so here's our last question of the day. Explain why plastics are not recyclable. I'm not sure that's true.
It depends on the dye and stuff like that in it. It's not true for all plastics. It depends.
Right.
Probably almost all heavy plastics are recyclable. But the blades aren't made of plastics, and the monopoles aren't made of plastics. They're made of resin and fibers, composite materials that Anthony mentioned, and I saw this report too, that, we've got this breakthrough technology that will be able to recycle all this. And it may, I don't know. Has it been tested in the marketplace yet? How many years down the road are we from the breakthrough to actual marketplace entry? What we know now is that we can't recycle them, or it costs enormous amounts to do it. We can dissolve them with acetone. We break them apart with the resins and the glues, but that doesn't put them back into useful use, which is what recycling usually means.
Yeah, what you're saying, they're made out of largely fiberglass in the blades. And what I have heard is that they are trying to develop blades that are recyclable by not using as much fiberglass. But what I have seen in some research has shown that it increases the weight to use other materials. So then they start having a drive shaft problem where, like we discussed early on in the show, if they stop dead for too long, they can start causing problems on their moving parts. So they have to hook up diesel generators to keep them moving. And that happened in Texas too. Some of those turbines that shut down in that big ice storm a couple of years ago ended up needing to be repaired and replaced because the drive shaft was messed up by them sitting frozen for so long.
And 2 years later, probably will have to be done again now.
Yeah.
I would be interested. The manufacturers, the corporations say, 25 to 30 year useful life. So we have an experiment, right? We have California. California, the largest wind farm out there in California, has been up for decades. I'd be interested to know if any single turbine, we know the group as a whole have not lasted 30 years, but I'd be interested to see if any single turbine met the manufacturer's standard for lasting 25 or 30 years. I would wager not.
Yeah, I can say that they have not. And that's basically from my brother-in-law and his experience with the Cincinnati Gear company that made those gearboxes. They got killed because they were stuck under warranty. These things just didn't last. The best engineers, that have been doing gearboxes, these guys, Cincinnati Gear made gearboxes for the Navy, for ships, also a very harsh environment. And so they thought, these wind turbines are a piece of cake. Well, it turns out they weren't. And the wind turbines just simply munched those gearboxes, and the company went under. And so a lot of those wind turbines out there in Tehachapi that you see sitting idle as you drive along 58 over towards the desert, they're dead and stinking and have been for years, and they'll stay that way.
And then you have to drive through at night and see all those slow blinking red lights. And it's just the worst thing in the world when you drive past a really big industrial scale wind farm, because it's just hypnotizing. It's the worst. I hate it.
Yep, it is. It is indeed. All right. Well, that concludes episode 51 of Climate Change Roundtable, which we're going to retitle as Wind Power Blows. Anyway, before we go, I want to tell everyone about the event coming up here in just a couple of weeks. That is the International Conference on Climate Change, number 15, which is going to be held in Orlando, Florida. true crisis, climate change or climate policy. We will all be there, and you can get to meet us in person, to attend the sessions that we're putting together. There's going to be a lot of fantastic information presented. There's going to be a lot of big names there too. People like Alex Epstein. We've got some politicians like Boebert is coming there. We've got we've got a lot of folks that are going to be making some fantastic presentations, including Dr. Judith Curry, who was recently banned from our video on YouTube because, she said some things apparently that they didn't like. So they decided to use an old video from 2 years ago to make us not show it, but that backfired. So anyway, please think about registering at ICC 15. Just go to climateconference.heartland.org. I'll say that again, climateconference.heartland.org, and register. We'd love to see you there. We'd love to hear your opinions and talk to you and see what you have to say about climate change in general. Okay, so that wraps it up. For Sterling Burnett and Linnea Lueken, I am Anthony Watts, Senior Fellow for Environment and Climate at the Heartland Institute, wishing you a good day.